for a long time, people really found, and particularly following the events of 9/11, Islamophobia was a very helpful term that described how the fear of Muslims was driving US policy, was driving US society and culture, news media, and it was also dictating the experience of Muslims living in the United States and Muslims living in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But as more and more people started to look at how Islamophobia expresses itself, a lot of people realize, this smells like, walks like, and talks like racism. And so, um, how is that different than, or similar to, how is Islamophobia different than or similar to racism as such? And so the language has kind of shifted towards anti-Muslim racism, because when we take a look at how Islamophobia expresses itself, it expresses itself in a way that very much has to do with Islam as a religion, or Islam as we make it out to be. It's often based on very spurious and unreliable misunderstandings of how Islam operates in the lives of Muslims across the world. That could be a whole other podcast. But often we create Muslims into a racial category. And we even, bring others into that.
Hey there, Josh Salzberg here with Lutherans for Racial Justice. LRJ co-founder Matt Gonzalez and I had a chance to talk to Ken Chitwood about his new book, Boricua Muslims, Everyday Cosmopolitanism Among Puerto Rican Converts to Islam. And yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. We get into all of it, talk about Puerto Rican culture, Matt Gonzalez's background coming from that heritage. We also talk about Islam and what we have to learn about Muslims' misunderstandings that have been popular in U.S. culture, and why it's so important as an LRJ community that we break down some of those misunderstandings and bridge those divides. So excited for you guys to listen. Check it out and let us know what you think in the comments.
I really wanted this book to be shot through with the stories of Puerto Rican Muslims themselves, because I had the humble honor to listen to and learn from so many different Puerto Rican converts to Islam, and others who were born Muslim, those who come from Palestine but live in Puerto Rico, or were born in Puerto Rico and identify as Palestinian, and then a bunch of others within their orbit. So the 111 interviews that this book comes from are just the main interviews, but there are all these lives that I got to intersect with along the way, and they were always so hospitable and kind and open to speak with me. Sometimes they weren't either, and I understood that. I got that. Who is this guy coming into our mosques, into our town, into our lives, and basically being the annoying kid on the playground who was always going up to others and being like, what are you playing, and why do you do it that way, and can I join in? Which is basically who I've always been. And I just got fascinated with the story of first Latino Muslims when I met the first Latino Muslim to come into my life in Houston, Texas, all the way back in 2012. And then as I came to discover, Puerto Ricans played an outsized role in the development of this broader Latino Muslim community and identity. And so I felt kind of called to learn more about their story in particular. And that took me to Puerto Rico, but it also took me to New York and to parts of New Jersey. Texas took me online. And then where I was based during that research was in Gainesville, Florida. And actually the research came to me in Florida as well, into my own home, into the city where I lived, but then also to places like Orlando and Miami as well.
So much work.
It's also fun work because, having to go to Puerto Rico is not a burden. It's a wonderful place, right? Beaches were a part of my field work, both part of the work, but then also part of the play that I would have on the side. So I never regret the decision to have decided to do research in the Caribbean. That's been a nice knock-on effect of the research.
That's so
I think
cool.
the only thing you missed was not having a Puerto Rican Lutheran with you, that should have just traveled with you and done it all with you,
Yeah,
just a
sorry
thought,
about that. Yeah, yeah.
Maybe a sequel, maybe a sequel.
that's right. Well, it was interesting to me because there's so much in the book that resonates with, I mean, just in a unique way, being a Puerto Rican in the LCMS and in Lutheranism, different obviously from a religious standpoint, but so similar in, I thought it was interesting that the concept of a quadruple minority, right? Like there's all these different kind of angles to, um, kind of the minority mindset and realizing that that's something that's it has to be considered at the very least, and really thought through because we even use the term minority kind of as a broad-based term, but it's, well, in what ways are you, in the minority, and how does that affect you, and all these kinds of things. I thought that was so cool, and really fascinating just to hear those perspectives because I think that's something that probably gets glossed over, in a lot of different ways, and to hear that and to hear those voices was really powerful.
Yeah, and to jump off of that, like what Matt's talking about there, the complex identities, and that's a big thing you keep talking about in the book, is like no one is identifiable by any one broad, marker. I'm thinking of like Abdullah, who you spend time with in New York, who was a part of the Latin street gangs, and he's not just a Puerto Rican or a Muslim, but he's a New Yorker, and so it's all of that identity being mixed up with everything else. Do you mind if I read a quote from him? Because I think it was just
Oh,
so
yeah.
great.
I always love hearing from Abdullah.
Oh my gosh. So he says, I got into corrections at Rikers on the legal side of things as a corrections officer, but I didn't tell anybody at the mosque. Everybody thought we were being watched by the CIA, FBI, and White House, and they were right. We were. Today is the same feeling. 9/11 didn't change anything. It just reminded us that we are always outsiders in America. And that to me
Mm.
was like, man, this is a guy wrestling with all all three of those identities among his identity with, street gangs and now as a correction officer. And just what a unique perspective. So for me, I guess I kept thinking about maybe how sometimes it's easy to oversimplify what cross-cultural ministry or social work looks like.
Mm.
Yeah, so I just interested in hearing like a bit more about how you unpack that. There's no simple identity, and how you get into people's complex identities in the book.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you also, Matt, for sharing your experience as you encountered the book. And I'm so happy that it resonated with you. You work on something like this for a long time and you put it out in the world and you're just excited to see people join the conversation that you've been part of. I used to read books and people would say, I've been working on this book for 10 years. And I'm like, why did it take you so long? And then here I am now. And I'm like, I've been working on this book for 10 years. And as I put in the acknowledgements, like this book has always been with me from the time I met Paula, my wife, to now. So this book is older than our relationship. And so it's always neat to then see it go out there and other people interact with it and for it to speak to you with your kind of Puerto Rican, Lutheran background is something. And then also, Josh, that these things are resonating with you because I think all of us in some way are dealing with overlapping and intersecting identifications and loyalties and feelings of belonging or not belonging. And in a world of immense movement of ideas and people and objects and finances, and where we are encountering diversity and difference every single day of our lives, we all feel like we're in the minority. And so part of what I wanted to do here was to look at a relatively small, very small community, but a very complex case study in terms of how those marginalizations overlap, where Puerto Rican Muslims are, in general, right, minorities in every community they claim membership in. So their belonging is constantly being undercut by the community that they want to be a part of, feel part of, and yet are ostracized from at the same time. And so, how do they navigate those feelings as actual, real, quadruply minoritized people? For others who maybe are not actually minoritized but feel that way, what might we learn from that? And that's the community that I come from, white, broadly Anglo-Saxon, European, mutt Protestant in the United States or here in Germany. Um, there are people who look like me, have similar heritage to me, come with the same privileges as me, and we feel like we're losing our privilege in this pluralism that is now taking hold, and we're making some interesting choices. So I wanted to look at the choices of a group that's actually kind of on the sharp edge of the minoritization experience. And the quadruple minoritization I talk about with Puerto Rican Muslims is just one aspect of it. I mean, you raise this up with Abdullah. There's other minoritizations that come into play when you're dealing with individuals, whether they be women or people like him who live in Staten Island, which, as any New Yorker knows, is the butt of every joke. And Staten Island's treated like this ugly stepchild almost, and yet that's home to him. And he's also a ninja, which is just like my favorite thing about him. He's this Puerto Rican Muslim New Yorker ninja, and he's got that layer of his experience to add to the mix.
Ninja's an
And
identity
so,
marker, I think. Yeah.
Oh, for
oh, it
sure.
is, and for Abdullah, it's a big one, because he lives above his dojo, and he's got
I love it.
like ninja and martial arts related art mixed in with Islamic art and things. And he that animated his life as much as being Muslim in some ways. So I wanted to really draw attention to the ways in which these individuals, these communities navigate life, and the ways they grab at a great amount of anything at all to make sense of their place in the world, to feel connected to others when they're often very isolated for various reasons, and then also to co-become, as I talk about in the book, with other people, despite the immense differences that they might feel, and despite the ostracization that they might be subject to. And so if they can do it, what might people like myself learn from them? And that's where I kind of end the book, is talking about getting to know one another. And I hope Puerto Rican Muslims feel that I've at least made that attempt to get to know them and to honor their navigation of those minoritizations that in some way all of us are dealing with, but they are dealing with in a very particular and pointed way.
And that's why, I know you mentioned that this is a relatively small, community or population that we're talking about, but I think that's where we really wanted to talk about this with Lutherans for Racial Justice community, because whether you're in a Lutheran school teaching a world religions class, or you have a ministry, at your church that's reaching across cultures, or you just are in a community, which most of us are, that have cultural differences, or religious differences. The book, I think, just gives a great, if not model, a great kind of template for what, working across cultures, and how to do that in an effective and sensitive and respectful way, what that looks like. I guess we should, on that note, define. You brought up, pluralism in the title. Say cosmopolitanism, and you talk about the difference between cosmopolitanism as this like political idea, which would be like pluralism. The idea of like having to live together, equal rights, maybe on a global level. But then you juxtapose that against cosmopolitanism as a reality, like a social process. Can you unpack that a bit for us?
Yeah. Great question. And I'm glad you picked up on my use of the word pluralism earlier. We are dealing with a world that is, simultaneously extremely global and also extremely local. And there's all types of ways that manifests in our lives, and it's very disorienting. And so we've adopted a lot of different words and a lot of different language to help describe that process and to try to understand that process over, the last 100 or so years, where globalization has taken on increased speed and compressed both time and space for all of us. And early on, I was dealing with this idea of pluralism. A lot of my writing and a lot of my work was around this idea of pluralism. And I tried to differentiate when I would speak to Lutheran churches who were feeling the pinch of pluralism as a political goal, perhaps, that we're supposed to have this plural society, these plural communities, etc. And they weren't so happy about that. And then I tried to differentiate that from pluralism as social fact. Like our communities are just getting more diverse, and we're gonna have to figure this out. And I do the same thing with cosmopolitanism, or a similar thing with cosmopolitanism. When we think of the cosmopolitan, we either think of a cocktail, B, a magazine, or C, we think of people who are going to be drinking that cocktail and reading that magazine, possibly on a flight to Dubai or to their home in the Caribbean or whatever it might be. We tend to associate it with elites, right? In fact, there's this parlance out there, the cosmopolitan elite. They're just able to flit around from country to country and experience not being a citizen of any one land, but a citizen of the world. And that's this idea of cosmopolitan being. And I make a case for, I think, and along with many other voices, that cosmopolitanism is a much more everyday affair. There's various kinds of cosmopolitanism. And perhaps it's better to not think of cosmopolitanism as this, thing that elite people do or elite people aspire to attain or to force on the rest of us, and instead as an everyday social reality that we've got to figure out how to deal with. And I show how one particular community deals with it. And I think the other key thing that came to my mind as I did this work, I mean, I do have a cosmopolitan goal. I hope that we all might become citizens of the world in a bigger and broader way, because I think that kind of life is just a lot more fun. If you're open to the world and everything that it has to offer, there's so much to encounter, to enjoy, to engage with, to learn from. Gosh, I've certainly benefited from it in my life and in my career. But I realize that for other people, that process can be quite the disturbing and destructive process as well. Encountering other cultures, encountering other people can feel like, and often feels like, loss. And for Puerto Rican Muslims, there's both loss and gain. There's both challenge and opportunity. And so how do they navigate being cosmopolitan from below, one might say?
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about kind of understanding of self in that whole thing. And I think, you had like, I mean, it was fascinating to me and exciting in some ways, the chapter you did on just the pride of being Puerto Rican, because I think a lot of people don't. I mean, there are probably so many people who don't get it, and I thought it was really well done, because I think it's something that I really had to learn growing up. Like, it's just a part of, it's a cultural thing, but it's more. I don't know. I don't know. I thought you explained it really well, but it's something that, like, when seeing it written down when you've lived it was, I don't I don't know about the words. It was jarring in a good way, right? Like, I was like, oh yeah, of course, this is, and the interesting part is, as a Puerto Rican, you're like, everybody knows this. But seeing it written down, you're like, oh my gosh, nobody knows this. Like, this is important that it's, being written. Um, yeah, could talk more about that. Like, what was your kind of experience hearing that from people you were speaking with?
Yeah. Yeah, I think a lot of people, I can't speak from within the community and how that feels to kind of have it put down in writing, because again, it's just kind of, it's in your bones, it's in your body in a lot of ways. It's just part of who you are. Whatever culture you grew up in, you're like the frog slowly boiled in water, right? You just don't realize it's happening. And for me as an outsider, I think I'm like a lot of people in the United States who don't realize or don't fully appreciate what Puerto Rico is, who Puerto Ricans are. We may have heard of this archipelago, we might have heard of these people, but how we place them, how we categorize is very slippery. It's all over the place, and most people don't have any recognition of the situation, the culture, the place, unless maybe they've vacationed there. And even if they have, they probably have had a very different experience depending upon how they vacationed there. My first encounter with Puerto Rican culture was kind of real encounter was through sports. I saw Puerto Ricans playing baseball, and I'm always a big baseball fan, always been a big baseball fan. And so I'd see, you know, Puerto Ricans in sports as a national team. And so I was like, oh, okay, they're a nation. Puerto Rico's a nation, just like all these other Caribbean nations I've heard of, like the Bahamas or Cuba or Jamaica, etc. And then in the 2004 Olympics, when Puerto Rico beat you know, the U.S. Dream Team, and it was this massive moment, and I started to lean a little bit more into this aspect of what it means to be Puerto Rican and this Puerto Rican pride, and this pride of being a people without a nation. Because I later came to realize, oh, this isn't a nation. This is a
Mhm.
free associated state, which is this euphemism for being a U.S. colony. And how do they then express themselves as a people without a nation? And one of the ways is this Boricua pride, this strong sense of Puerto Ricanness, and that's expressed in music and architecture and food and language and pretty much any aspect of culture you can imagine. Puerto Ricans are very proud of it, and of course Puerto Ricans disagree with one another and they have critiques of one another, and there's different understandings of what being Puerto
That's part
Rican
of being
means,
Puerto Rican. Yeah.
and that's part of being Puerto Rican, right? Yeah. And so I kind of just kind of came into it, and I wanted to honor that because Puerto Rican Muslims honor that, right? I mean, there's all types of Boricua pride among Boricua Muslims, and so wanted to pay attention to that, lean into that, and see, okay, what else is going on here? How are they re-understanding, re-signifying, remixing their experience of architecture, of food, of interactions with family and friends and language and music? And that chapter is the longest chapter in the book. That is not by accident. There was just so much there, because there was other things that they were remixing and resignifying that I couldn't even include. I mean, that chapter could have been an entire book, but I felt like there were other aspects to touch on as well. But yeah, I mean, it was just everywhere you looked, and people were so proud to show it off to me, to talk to me about it, to wrestle with it, and to share that experience with me.
An interesting thought was just thinking about, and something you talked about in the book, about the decentering of the American story while telling American stories, and kind of what that means, and the tension in that. Can you talk a little bit about that, like that tension as you're putting it together?
You might notice that I try to be careful with my language in calling the United States rather than calling it America. Because one of my ticks is when people say, "Well, I'm American, right?" Or "I'm from America." And I know it's a few more syllables to say United States in conversations, and it's shorthand, and I get why people say that. It's also United States of America, but part of my teaching and my writing is to help people understand that United States is part of a broader American experience that is this entire hemisphere, and has both been shaped by that broader American hemispheric experience, which is connected across the Atlantic Ocean to Africa and to Europe, and places beyond and in between, but has also done a lot of shaping of the broader American hemispheric experience. And we have done that in a very from a position of extreme power, militarily, politically, economically. And we've been able to kind of shove people around as we will for quite a long time. Even before the United States emerged as this kind of this narrative that the US became a global power post World War II. But even before World War II, we were flexing our global might largely in places like the Caribbean and in Latin America. And we've only expanded that since. And, the president of the United States, Donald Trump, right now wanting to, make Canada the 51st state, is just another expression of that. We're just directing some of that energy northward for a little while. When we've acquired property, we've acquired lands, we've acquired people south of our border for a long time. And Puerto Rico is one of the clearer ways we've done that, acquiring an island that was independent for the briefest of moments after hundreds of years under Spanish colonial power, and then in 1898 became a U.S. colony. But we've also, expressed that power in more clandestine and more hidden ways in Central America and in South America. So I think it's always helpful to think about the ways in which the United States acts and works in the world, and how being an American in that sense comes with a certain responsibility, a certain obligation to first understand that, and then to steward that, and to walk with that well, so that we don't bludgeon our way through the world, but instead we perhaps more humbly enter into it, realizing that people have interacted with the United States in some way, shape, or form throughout the world. That's not necessarily true of Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans. And so there becomes a power differential there. And part of telling this story is to help us understand the United States in a broader way and in a bigger way. And when we think about American religion, to think about places like Puerto Rico and beyond.
That's really helpful, and I'm glad we really unpacked like the Puerto Rican side, specifically of the book, just especially given the moment we're in, where so many people, Puerto Ricans or otherwise, are being categorized as migrants, whether they are or not, or citizens, whether they are or not non-citizens, and so I think that's another just important aspect of the book of not to lump in a Puerto Rican experience or identity with every experience, but as right now we are dealing with, deportation issues and everything else happening in the U.S. I think getting to understand the world from the specific experiences is really, really helpful. On the other side
Can,
of
can
it,
I?
oh, sorry, go for it.
I wanted to jump in there if you don't
Yeah,
mind. I know you're not asking a question, but you prompted an important thought, I think, when it
yeah.
comes to understanding the Puerto Rican experience, because this thing where Puerto Ricans get lumped in with other communities very quickly because of certain racialized notions of who they are. And that's an essential part of the Puerto Rican experience from what I've learned and seen and encountered, is that when you're in Puerto Rico, you're Puerto Rican, and there's racial dynamics in the archipelago as well. They've wrestled with what it means to have Taino indigenous heritage, Spanish heritage, African heritage, and then also this, United States input, as well over the last 130 years about, and they often neglect the African element of that identity, right? But when they come to the United States as citizens and they arrive here, they immediately get placed into the United States racial order. Uh, Many Puerto Ricans who would never have identified as Black on the island, when they came to New York, suddenly were termed Black by the people around them. And it was quite surprising for them to be labeled as such, because I said, no, 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 I'm not Black. And yet everyone's like, no, no, you're Black, and so they entered into new racial orders that were not operative on the archipelago. And they also get coded as a migrant, an immigrant, right? Which, yes, in some sense they are a migrant, but they get coded as an immigrant. They get coded as quote unquote illegal, whatever they get coded as. And this is a very disjointing experience for Puerto Ricans who sit there and say, I've never understood myself that way. I am a U.S. citizen, etc. And so, part of the Puerto Rican Muslim experience is also dealing with that when they move between the United States and Puerto Rico, and they are able to very freely, very openly. People used to refer to airplanes as the Airbus. It was so easy to go between Puerto Rico and New York, to arrive at LaGuardia, and it felt like you were just going down the street. And yet they entered into whole new understandings of race and peoplehood when they wound up there, and quickly became this American subclass, and that was jarring for them. So now get to your actual question, as I rudely interrupted and talked.
Well, no, now you've got me on a tangent because there's so much to unpack there. Matt, go for it.
No, and it's interesting. I think it's still something that as a Puerto Rican, as you grow up in it, and then as you kind of, at least for me, my experience getting older was, you know, recognizing the beauty of kind of all the cultures that, created the Boricua, right? Like kind of all these really different people groups that make up what it means to be Puerto Rican. And then at the same time, the struggle of then realizing that nobody understands that, from a broader perspective. So filling out, simple things, job applications, those kinds of things. And it's like, what's your race or ethnicity? And I'm like, I don't know how to answer this. And so what ends up happening is it's always, multi-ethnic or these kinds of things. But then if they ask for specifics, I've found myself more than ever kind of listing like African, Native American, Caucasian, African, Native American, white, whatever it is, because that's what makes up a Puerto Rican. And once you learn the history, at least for me, I found myself recognizing I don't want to lose that, and
Mm.
being in New York, it's been really fascinating because, obviously I'm run a school here and having students, international students, we have a number from different parts of the continent of Africa. So Chad and Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, Democratic Republic of Congo, and connecting with them. I mean, it moved me to do one of these ancestry things to get a sense of what's the, African heritage in my life. And, we had a student from Mali, and my DNA marker is like 1.3% from Mali. And so we talked so much about it because I was like, we're from the same country. And he just thought that was the funniest thing. But it was one of these things where I thought it was so powerful because you don't realize the importance of that. And then the importance of being able to connect with people from those countries and say, like, as a Puerto Rican, we have an intimate connection that, is historical in nature, but also, very deeply tied in a way. And so, yeah, I think that's just such a cool aspect of it all.
Bringing back the kind of unexpected roots that you're bringing up there, you also talk about the African roots of Islam, or rather, Kamal talks about the African roots of Islam. Let's read a quote from him real quick. They are our ancestors in the struggle, he said. It's not just about their oppression and omission, but about how they resisted in big and small ways. The yoke placed upon them by history, by time, by those in power. We can learn from their example today, or at least we should. And I guess I'm bringing that up more as you unpack how typically Islam is not necessarily associated first with Africa or having African roots, but for Kamal, that's a really important part of the heritage there that he's inherited. And yeah, I guess I'm just interested in how much of that, yeah, impacts. Or I don't know. Could you unpack a little more about like where Kamal's coming from with that perspective?
Yeah, for sure. Always love hearing from Kamal as well. So, um, yeah, I think in our understandings, our imaginings of what Islam is and where Islam comes from is based, etc. There is a bias towards the Middle East and to Arab cultures, countries, Arabic as a language, and there's certainly good reason for that, right? Islam, as we know it today, emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula, but as it did so in the 7th century, it also already started taking root in or on the continent of Africa in the very same century. And so the history of Islam in Africa and African Muslims goes back as long as the history of Islam in Arabia and in the Middle East. And part of what I want to do this book is just show how interconnected our world is, right? It is just shot through with these entanglements, these connections between one place and another. And we miss out on a lot of the story of global Muslim life if we just think of it as something from particular geographies like the Middle East or maybe North Africa, or throw in South Asia. And that's about the limit of our geography of Islam. But when in reality, only 20% of the world's Muslims live in the Middle East. And so we miss out on millions of Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa that we just don't think about. And part of the Puerto Rican Muslim story is also connected to the continent of Africa through the, horrible entanglement of the transatlantic trade in enslaved persons. And among those who were brought forcibly from coastal West Africa to Puerto Rico and other places within the Spanish colonial Caribbean, about 10, maybe to 20%. The numbers are extremely hard to guess at. were Muslim, and they brought their knowledge and their practice and their embodiment, their lived experience of Islam with them, and interpreted and lived through the experience of being enslaved from the fact that they were Muslim. And that happened across the American hemisphere. There's amazing stories that come out of places like South Carolina and Georgia and Muslim slave accounts that have now been produced from institutions like the Smithsonian and elsewhere that you can get a hold of. Or there was a Muslim rebellion in Brazil in the 19th century that took place during Ramadan, and pushing back against their enslavers. It was unsuccessful, but they drew on Islam and the practice thereof to empower themselves, and that's what Kamal and Puerto Rican Muslims are drawing on as well, is this history of resistance, of being people who were enslaved. They push back, grounded in their faith, and seeing in their faith liberatory power. And so Puerto Rican Muslims who feel ostracized, who feel marginalized by family or friends or society or at their local mosque, they draw on that story, they draw on those narratives to say, well, there's pride in being a Black Muslim. If that's how I want to identify, then that's how I will identify. And there's a proud history there to draw on. And so Kamal and others do that. But a lot of times they also draw on other, lineages, other heritages, whether that be Islamic Spain, and saying, well, before, being Hispanic meant being Roman Catholic in a lot of people's minds and in a lot of different cultures and societies. Well, a lot of us were Muslim, and look at Spanish. It's got 3,000 words from Arabic or whatever it might be. Or they even, make an attempt to say that Muslims from Africa were the first to come to the Caribbean and actually impacted Taino culture. We don't have any evidence that that is true, but for many, they draw on that idea to help ground themselves in all these different aspects of Puerto Rican identity that you were talking about, Matt, whether it's Taino indigenous, whether it's Spanish, Iberian, or whether it's African. And they say, well, each one of those has in some way been inflected by Islam, whether or not it has, and to what extent it has or not. It's an empowering move for them.
I feel like that's a good reminder too in our Lutheran world corner of the church that we're in. How many stories are missing, how many identities are missing, how many people are missing from the history or present day that clearly the Islam experience is not something I have personally associated with the American slave trade. So that's a big learning point for me for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that people they don't catch on to just and it's me for me it's a different angle, but this idea of like if you're Puerto Rican you're Roman Catholic, and I think it's funny because my experience was you're either Roman Catholic or Pentecostal in some way, and that's how my parents became Lutheran, because my mom was Roman Catholic, my dad was Pentecostal, and they were like, we need to find some sort of middle ground, and in the craziest way ever, a pastor just happened to knock on my parents' door and invited them to a Lutheran church. And they were like, this is good enough. This is what we'll do. So it's just, I think, becoming a minority in that way was crazy. But also, reading your book, thinking about what was that experience like for those, Muslims that it happened by chance or they weren't necessarily born into it, but they had somebody reach out or these kinds of things. And was it somebody in the Puerto Rican community or not? I mean, all that stuff is just cool to think about. And I think there's so many people who would never think to tackle a thing like this. So I think that's really cool.
And next time I do this research project, I'll make sure you come with me for sure.
Yes, I will meet. We'll hang out for sure.
It's going to be a 10-year journey though. So
that's fine. Yeah. That's fine. That's fine. Little by little.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on, in addition to all the other complexities that you unpack in the book, you talk about Islamophobia, and unpack how it's not as simple as religious discrimination. Is that something you could touch on real quick?
Yeah. I think people have been wrestling like I talked before about, we throw around terms to try and help and understand our world. And nerdy people like myself, academics, may have a role in coining some of those terms or popularizing some of those terms. And Islamophobia as a term is helpful in a lot of ways because, it builds on words like xenophobia, which is a fear of others. And so, people have seen how fear of Muslims animates a lot of society in the United States and elsewhere, right? In Europe, where I am, big part of it. In Germany, where I am in particular, is a big part of society and culture here as well. And for a long time, people really found, and particularly following the events of 9/11, Islamophobia was a very helpful term that described how the fear of Muslims was driving US policy, was driving US society and culture, news media, and it was also dictating the experience of Muslims living in the United States and Muslims living in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. But as more and more people started to look at how Islamophobia expresses itself, a lot of people realize, this smells like, walks like, and talks like racism. And so, how is that different than or similar to, how is Islamophobia different than or similar to racism as such? And so the language has kind of shifted towards anti-Muslim racism because when we take a look at how Islamophobia expresses itself, it expresses itself in a way that very much has to do with Islam as a religion or Islam as we make it out to be. It's often based on very spurious and unreliable misunderstandings of how Islam operates in the lives of Muslims across the world. That could be a whole other podcast. But often we create Muslims into a racial category. And we even, bring others into that, right? So a big example is how Sikh people are members of the Sikh faith, who men who wear turbans or women who may wear a head covering of sort, although they do not do that all the time in public, get codified as Muslims. There's also anti-Sikh racism and anti-Sikh, rhetoric out there, but they're sometimes lumped in, or sometimes Latinos are assumed to be Muslim, or what have you. And so we've kind of created this racial category of the Muslim. And so more people are thinking about this in terms of how racism operates in the world. And that we've created this category of race called Muslim. And I think that's really helpful in a lot of ways for us to think about the world in general. So when we think about anti-Muslim racism, we can think about how race is a constructed category, that it's a variable marker of identification, but it's something we construct, something we create, something that we continue to create, and then we treat it as if it's an object outside of ourselves that acts back upon us when we're really the ones kind of making this up as we go. It's a myth we know we're making, and then it controls us. I meet so many people who cannot think beyond the frames that anti-Muslim racism has provided to them. So many Muslims are my dear, dear friends. Some of my best friends are Muslim. And we disagree about a lot of stuff when it comes to religion and God and the fate of everyone who's ever lived. Some pretty fundamental disagreements. But they're good people. They're great people. I love interacting with them, talking with them, learning from them. And I think anti-Muslim racism prevents so many people from being able to appreciate Muslims as human beings, as people with all these varying identifications and interests and expressions of themselves beyond being Muslim. And so I think in my discussion of Islamophobia, I want to help people understand it as a form of racism that is inflicted with particular forms of power and particular forms of violence, but then to maybe invite people to see beyond the frames that in many ways have been forced upon them by the media. And I say that as a working journalist, from the political arena, from their church, from their pastor. And a lot of that is based in ignorance and misunderstanding and a lack of getting to know people who may believe or think or act or look differently than you and me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think it's common language in our Lutheran circles to false testimony gets brought up a lot when maybe authority figure is questioned or other things like that. You want to make sure you're not bearing false testimony against somebody. And hearing you talk about the anti-Muslim sentiments and the racial sentiments around that as well, I think that feels like a great place to maybe think about false testimony and how much what we're repeating is true or not, and actually represents the people we're talking about. Um,
Yeah, because I think that's really helpful, Josh. I mean, we do place emphasis on not bearing false testimony about people putting the best construction on things is one of the ways old man Luther talks about, you know, the way we navigate being in communal life together. And if we have Muslim neighbors, and odds are in the United States, you do, whether literally on the cul-de-sac where you live or in the apartment building where you are, they may be your coworker, they may be your boss, they may be your banker, they may be the person serving you food or the person who's ordering food from you, whatever and whoever they might be, they are your neighbor in a very local sense. They're also your neighbor in a global sense. Christianity and Islam are the two largest religions in the world. We constitute more than half of the population around the globe. We've got to figure this out, getting to know one another. And Muslims have their own issues with Christians and their own misperceptions and misunderstandings. And, I'm not here to talk about that. I've encountered them. I've dealt with them and had some really fun conversations around them. But the number one thing is just been able to yeah, not yeah, to put the best construction on who my Muslim neighbor is, and then to yeah, not bear false witness or false testimony about them. It's very easy to feel like you're an expert on Islam because there's a lot that's floating around out there about it. But I can confidently say that most of what we think we know about Islam is not true or is far more nuanced and complex than we're giving it credit for. And so invite you to just kind of again lean in and learn more. And a great way to start is to get to know your Muslim neighbor, whether locally or halfway around the world or in Puerto Rico.
you model these conversations about what it's like to have conversations across religious differences so well in the book. But I was also really inspired. If anybody hasn't heard the conversation that Ken had with Simranjit Singh, who is Sikh or Sikh, depending on what you're familiar with there, is just was a great example for me of you guys just talked openly about differences between faith and practice, and then found so much common ground within that. That is not to say, oh, both religious traditions or practices are the same, but that there's so much shared value in place that you can bring the conversation forward and find a way to work together and live together and these kind of things. That really helped give me a template for how to have those conversations. So,
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing that up. Simran's a dear friend of mine. Most of that, most of the credit for that friendship goes to Simran. He's just a really easy person to know and to be around. We've been roommates at some conferences together, looking to save money. We've gotten to hang out, far more than I think we ever thought we would when we first met each other. And he's been a real gift to me. And as you mentioned, again, we come from two different faiths, but we're able to talk about a lot of things in common, whether that be basketball in the San Antonio Spurs. You get Simran started on that, and he can talk for a long time. And I can talk about Lakers and Spurs with him and riff on those themes. But we can also talk about, and this is, we were talking about Lutheran ways of looking at the world, and one of the ways that Lutherans operate and look at the world is through this notion of the two kingdoms. And this is related to other things like two kinds of righteousness. And I won't go into the righteousness side, but these like two kingdoms where we talk about a left-hand kingdom and a right-hand kingdom. And the right-hand kingdom has to do with like these ultimate eternal things. It's the kingdom of God's grace. And then this left-hand kingdom is kind of temporal, earthly things. It's somehow called it the kingdom of God's power. And God rules over, operates in both, is kind of this Lutheran understanding of the two kingdoms. And Lutherans have long said, where we disagree with people in matters of the right-hand kingdom, we can still work together with people in matters of the left-hand kingdom. In fact, we must. And we know God rules over that, and God blesses that, and God works through people who do not share our opinions about God and eternity and the fate of everyone who ever lived. We still work together in economics and politics and culture and doing good in the world. And that's where Cimarron and I have been able to find so much common ground, is in doing that work of the left-hand kingdom, you might say, from a Lutheran perspective. Cimarron would see it in a different way, right?
Well, and that's
And
what
that's
I
okay.
heard. Yeah, that's what I heard in that conversation, was so much that you'd assume there's a disagreement on, in that left-hand kingdom sense, was then clarified by you going, well, the Lutheran way of saying that would be this, and he'd go, well, from my tradition, here's how we
Mm-hmm,
would say it,
mm-hmm.
and we go, oh, we're saying the same things, but because
Yeah.
they feel different, it sounds like there's a disagreement when we're actually sharing a value or an interest in that way. So yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And I think I raised the left hand, right hand kingdom thing because I feel so many times when I'm hanging out with Lutherans and talking about the work I do and the people I hang out with and the people who animate my life and give it the joy and texture that make it what it is, um, it's almost like this like permission giving or this like unlocking of Lutherans sometimes to be like, you see, we have this like theological construct to make it okay to hang out with people who think and act and believe differently than us. And historically we've done that and been very proud of it, and we've lost our way in that a lot, and our language has shifted, and there's historical cultural reasons for that, why Lutherans in the United States of a particular ilk and variety are making that move, that come from our own history, stretching back to not too far away from where I am here in Germany, and some persecution that we did experience, and left from. Um, but it's also speaking to our present moment, where it's just so easy to divide and so easy to find reasons not to talk to somebody. And yet we've got this very rich theology that, like I said, sometimes I say this to Lutherans, and if I'm talking about like hanging out with Muslims or understanding their racial experience, racialized experience in the United States, like it's all like, oh, but, and then I say Lutheran theology framework, and they're like, oh, okay, now I could do that. Yeah, okay, I've got currency to write those checks with,
yeah.
or I shouldn't say that these days. Who writes checks? I've got currency to Venmo it. I've got Bitcoin to transfer, or whatever it might be. It kind of gives people permission to just be like, oh, I can wade into these relationships and have God's blessing as I do so.
This was really amazing, Ken. I encourage people to read the book, even if you're like, I have no interest in Puerto Rican Muslims, you're missing out. But I encourage you to read the book to grow in your understanding of people, to grow in your understanding of the importance of broadening our horizons. When we think about LRJ and the work that we do, it's at the very base, if you're gaining that knowledge and that information, especially even as believers in Christ, you can take that knowledge base in order to understand better how to share the gospel, at its baseline. I think there's so much more that you can do with some of this, but you got to get something, and I think it's just really cool and really powerful. And as a Puerto Rican, thank you for noticing. I think that's super important too. So yeah, I really appreciate your work.
Thank you, Matt. Joy to talk to you today, man.
if you want to understand the immigrant church that you're a part of, meaning the German Lutheran Church in the United
Yeah.
States,
Yeah.
because there is a fascinating history of persecution and assimilation and cosmopolitanism. I don't know if I'm using it
Yeah.
right in that sense, but yeah,
Mhm.
in there, if you want to understand that, let's look at a different religious tradition, different ethnic background, and how yeah, what that means to be those communities in the United States today. And I think there's a lot to learn there. Well, thanks again so much for sharing this, obviously for writing the book. I'd really encourage, again, if you're a world religions teacher, this is like a must a read. I'd also say like history too. Like this is for me, a missing piece of the United States story. Sorry. Um,
American Story is right too.
American
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
There you go,
yeah.
that too. It for me fills in a lot of pieces of what I feel like I've been missing from why we're at where we're at and where we've come from in that way. And then, yeah, churches too. You know, this may or may not be a thing that you go like, oh, let's have 50 people in our church, you know, I'll read the book and go through it. But I do think it's like if you're leading a Bible study or if you have a mission outreach ministry or anything like that. I think for a leader to read this book and then be able to share it with the congregation would be so helpful. So thanks again for taking the time. And you know, in 10 years, we'll talk about the next book.
You know, you won't have to wait long. My next book comes out in February. So thankfully that one's gonna come around a little quicker. I will say one other thing. If you're a church, if you're a group wanting to maybe talk about this stuff, braving reading the book, whatever it may be, happy to zoom in, happy to talk, happy to have a conversation. I've really enjoyed doing that in many different congregations over the years, and I'm always happy to connect. So people can find me if there's show notes or links or anything like
Yeah.
that. We can put my website in there, and there's a contact form.
KenChitwood.com.
Exactly. It's my name.com. So lame, but it is what it is. People can find me there, reach out, and I would love to have the conversation. At least if you're a pastor or a Lutheran who's just got questions, maybe you've got some issues with me as well and what I'm doing and how I'm operating. I love having those conversations. There's one guy who sent me an email 11 years ago after I went and spoke at his church. And we are still in touch to this day. He sends me, used to be an email a week. Now it's like an email a month. But I love being in dialogue with folks. I love talking to people, being that annoying kid on the playground. And I invite others to be that annoying kid on the playground with me as well. So please reach out.
You heard it from Ken. Don't forward your questions to info@lutheransforracialjustice.com. Just go to kenchitwood.com.